Here is the latest news, and I suggest we start with it. The Kremlin reports on a conversation between Putin and Macron. Details are scarce, but what the Russian side says focuses on a few key points. The point that was made in this conversation is that crises have to be resolved, that the solution to the crisis has to be comprehensive and long-term, involve the elimination of the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis, and be based on new territorial realities. Well, this is the whole story that we hear all the time, but again, it's being told to Macron. Let's take it one step at a time. Why do you think such a call has taken place right now? And then we will move on to analyzing the content, the one we have. In fact, we understand that Putin's situation is quite ambiguous right now. It is ambiguous in the sense that the results of, for example, the NATO summit cannot be called exclusively positive, but it cannot be said that the summit failed. The same applies to the G7 meeting. The outcome of this meeting is uncertain. This is not to say that the great democracies of the world have become more confident, more calm, and more convinced that they will defeat all dictators, but it is not to say that it was a complete disappointment. Trump left early. The joint communique was an absolute farce. What was going on with the potential joint communique? But in general, we saw that they were able to fix it at NATO. So now, against this backdrop of talk of Trump calling Putin, against the backdrop of Russia's apparent failure to understand what to do with the Middle East, where its attempts to mediate between Iran and Israel have been completely unsuccessful, it turns out that Moscow has found itself in a very ambiguous geopolitical position, where every further step must be measured against the background of how European leaders will react to it, how Trump will react to it, and so on. And so I think this call between Putin and Macron, from Russia's point of view, plays the role of top-level intelligence. In fact, the Russians have been using this reconnaissance tactic through a call for a very long time. Just think back to 2022, when, despite the fact that neither Macron nor Scholz had any results from Putin's calls, we saw how, after each such call, Russian propaganda and the narrative of the Russian elite slightly changed to hit even more sensitive points in Europe. So from Russia's point of view, such call is logical. They need to understand the situation better, and the fact that they consider Macron to be the de facto leader of Europe, it is logical from Moscow's point of view. From Macron's point of view, we need to dig deeper here. In fact, it's hard to say what this call might mean, whether it's Macron's attempts to play around and fight for some kind of conditional leadership in Europe, or whether it means a continuation of his personal policy, his personal game of de Gaulle diplomacy. But at the same time, we see that Macron maintains a very clear pro-Ukrainian position. We can see that despite his doubts about the deployment of peacekeepers in Ukraine, he has little doubt about continuing support, about the course to NATO, and everything else. So I would not look for treason here, but again, we still need to find out the real reasons for Macron's call. Agence France Presse writes that Macron expects to continue contacts with Putin. So, can we say that the call was a success? I'm not sure it went smoothly because he was hoping to extend the contract. Oops, a Freudian slip. I meant contacts with Putin after calls in 2022. We also see that over the past few months, France has been rather vague in its statements regarding the resumption of at least financial or banking cooperation with the Russians. So I don't think the idea here is to resume business as usual with the Russians, or indeed to restore some normal working relations. It's not for nothing that I mentioned the Gaullist policy that Macron often professes, or at least that is attributed to him. Let's not forget that, according to de Gaulle, the true leader of Europe, the president of France, since de Gaulle saw no one else as a potential European leader, must be a friend of Washington and a negotiator with Moscow. For Macron, these contacts, this call, and the continuation of all subsequent calls are simply an opportunity, relatively speaking, to facilitate political and geopolitical European leadership. Because with an active Merz, the French president really needs to become more active himself and become a greater European force. Even though they hadn't spoken for 3 years, as you rightly pointed out about the contracts, they still had contracts. And perhaps Macron hopes to extend these contracts as imports increased by 81% in 2023-2024. France became the second largest buyer of Russian LNG after the United States, spending about $2.6 billion in 2024. This is a problem not only because of France as such, but also because Europeans have been held back in terms of business recovery by Washington's position as usual. And now we see the lifting of some sanctions on banks that work with Russian nuclear energy programs, which are completing a nuclear power plant in Hungary.
Програмами атомної енергетики, які добудовують відповідно атомну електростанцію в Угорщині.
We can see how long it takes for American senators, politicians, American and their European partners to convince Trump that let's impose sanctions, let's increase the pressure, let's make sure that secondary sanctions work.
Давайте ми додатково посилимо тиск, давайте ми зробимо так, щоб
That is, Washington's passivity and its desire, in fact, to give the Russians a break. And even, by the way, the public statement by the U.S. Secretary of State that if we impose sanctions on Russia, we will not be able to talk to them, and therefore we will not impose sanctions. I think this is a kind of carte blanche. I would not rush to accuse Macron of being the key partner of Russia in Europe, but yes, we must really state the fact that unfortunately, French businesses are interested in restoring these contacts with the Russians. In fact, the repetition of these Kremlin narratives that were voiced in this conversation means that Putin is not flexible, so to speak.
Це означає, що Путін взагалі-то, не гнучкий, так би мовити.
In other words, he is not going to actually agree on anything in the third round of negotiations, because he himself said that these two memoranda are radically opposed. But even the non-verbal tone of his communication when he voiced this fact was positive, meaning that it was read between the lines as if the documents were different, but we would find a common language.
Так, документи різні, але от ми, знайдемо спільну мову. Як?
For the Russians, finding a common language means forcing us to surrender, or it means imposing a conditional Minsk III, Minsk IV on us, which will mean endless negotiations without any real result, and will not allow Ukraine to realize its geopolitical ambitions. Why does Putin sound so confident in this context? My personal opinion is that the passivity of Donald Trump as the self-proclaimed best negotiator in the world, who wanted to deal with these issues, who said that only he could do it and only now it is possible to sign something, to do something. Donald Trump's passivity, the lack of any additional proposals, and just general phrases about what is good, what you say, keep talking, allow the Russians to stall for time in this way. I am not convinced that his self-confidence will be realized. The Russians breaking through all their positions is far from certain. The armed forces and the Ukrainians will not allow this. But Russians realize that no one is actually forcing them to change their position. Therefore, they can stand by their version of the memorandum for as long as they want. That's why Putin's phrase that they are different, but so what? It basically gives us a hint that the Russians don't care when these negotiations start or how they go. They are ready to say for as long as they want that there will be negotiations and continue to kill Ukrainians, continue to shell our cities, continue to attack at the front, and bribe our allies or our so-called allies. Unfortunately, the Russians are now trying to at least pretend that time is playing in their favor. They are now in full control of the situation, and therefore they don't care if the memorandums are different. No one will force them, and is not forcing them now, to change their position. When they talk about taking into account new territorial realities, what do you think they mean?
То от, на ваш погляд, про що це?
Is it about the de facto situation, or is it about their past narrative that the armed forces need to go to the borders of the regions that they have included in their constitution?
Областей, які вони внесли в свою конституцію.
It seems to me that this is the logic of the Russians, or rather both the logic and a certain their domestic political and diplomatic culture is still based on self-confidence, if not real, then at least feigned self-confidence.
Якщо не реальні, то як мінімум напускні самовпевненості.
This self-confidence tells them that they will be able to reach the borders of these regions. This hypothesis is also supported by the fact that we have already discussed that they are not bothered by changing their negotiating position, and therefore they can wait as long as they want for the negotiations to actually start. While waiting for the start of negotiations, they are trying to seize more Ukrainian territories to move on. At the cost of huge losses, they still take one village a week, one village a month, but they still move on, and the logic for them is that by waiting for the start of negotiations, they can fulfill the goals they set for themselves. After that, they will set new goals, so I would have no doubt that after the Russians allegedly say that the goals of the SMO have been fulfilled, they will say, "We still need Kharkiv, Sumy, let's take half of Kiev region, let's divide along the Dnipro River." So their appetites will grow. But the idea is that they still believe or convince themselves or really believe that as long as no one forces them to actually negotiate, and as long as they can still lose 10,000 people a week, they can wait for the negotiations to start and move forward a little bit.
По 10 тисяч людей на тиждень, вони можуть чекати початку переговорів, а самі потроху просуватися вперед.
I would like to discuss another topic. The Lithuanian president said that the Baltic states should have a plan A, B, and C in case of new Russian aggression because of the U.S. position on the defense of Europe. It seemed to me that this issue was resolved at the NATO summit, wasn't it? Because Trump, who before the summit did not read the fifth article very clearly after the summit or during the summit, he read the fifth article properly and said that everything was fine. And Western publications are writing, to put it mildly, about some blackmail of Trump precisely because of this fifth article, that he demanded certain concessions and a 5% increase in spending on NATO. And he achieved this. If he has achieved this, then there are no ambiguities in Article 5. But then why does the president of Lithuania say that there is a certain position of the United States on the defense of Europe, and that this should be seen as a certain problem, as a certain risk? Look, the problems with reading Article 5 cannot go away, because the problems with reading Article 5 are the whole point of Article 5. The fifth article was not created to be enforced. The fifth article was created so that no one would want to check how it would be enforced. And so, in fact, this uncertainty will never go away. Indeed, this has been one of the key strategies of U.S. foreign policy for almost 80 years. This is a so-called strategic uncertainty tool that they have used, are using, and will continue to use for a very long time. So I would not expect any certainty. Just think of Biden, who accidentally once said that they would be ready to fight for Taiwan. And after that, the White House, the State Department, and the Pentagon were screaming for 2 months that it was a slip of the tongue and no one was actually planning to say that. With NATO, situation is the same. Lithuania's concern is understandable. Let's recall that at the NATO Madrid summit in 2022, the Baltic states unexpectedly learned that it turned out that the plan to invoke Article 5 in the event of Russian aggression against the Baltic states included a pause of almost 90 days when the Baltic states were either occupied or their cities and armed forces were being wiped out while Germany and America redeployed their forces and set up logistics.
Поки Німеччина і Америка перекидатимуть свої сили і налагоджують логістику.
At that time, unfortunately, what happened in Bucha and Irpin had already happened, and the Russians began to carry out their genocide. So the reaction of the Baltic states was radical. They say you've seen what Russians do in weeks. Imagine what 90 days of occupation would bring. So while you superheroes are going to be gathering here for a long time to save the world, what will happen to us in these 90 days? And then NATO's strategy really started to change. It wasn't just about the fifth article, it was about real military plans. Then they announced a plan to increase garrisons on the eastern flank tenfold.
На східному фланзі.
Then they announced a plan to improve infrastructure, logistics, and so on and so forth.
Далі і тому подібне.
It was a turning point in the modern history of NATO.
Історії НАТО.
And when Lithuanians say that we do not have this certainty, this does not mean any fear, any pessimism. It is a completely realistic and correct assessment of the situation.
І правильна оцінка ситуації.
Because not only are we dealing with Trump, but there can never be any certainty.
Ніколи не може бути.
We are dealing with an international political instrument that contradicts the very notion of certainty, which contradicts certainty in international relations.
Визначеності в міжнародних відносинах.
There is another interesting topic for our discussion. Erdogan said that the next NATO summit will be held in Ankara in July 2026. Remembering a book called The Next 100 Years, there was a certain prediction about the events that are coming. And there, Turkey was given a special place. Friedman believed that Turkey would become one of the world's top 10 economies by the 2020s and would be a stable military and political power. And we do see that despite certain economic problems, they are building their fleet, they have these ambitions, and these ambitions do not remain just words. In other words, they are indeed moving towards this, but the problem with the book is that it did not foresee a war of this kind against Ukraine. And we can say that Turkey's plans may have been postponed. But is this signal that the NATO summit will be held in Ankara next year a way for Turkey to become great? Or how should we read this signal? I would really read this as playing along with Turkey, but as a success of Erdogan's policy, as a success of his maneuvering, and as a success of his direction, that Turkey should play a key role not only in the Middle East, but also on NATO's eastern flank.
Його напрямку на те, що Туреччина має відігравати ключову роль не лише на Близькому Сході, але й на східному фланзі НАТО.
And that without Turkey, security in the Black Sea, eastern flank, and Middle East isn't possible.
Східного флангу неможливо, ані безпека Близького Сходу неможливо.
So, I think this is a complete success for Turkey.
Повний успіх Туреччини.
Despite the fact that such assessments overlooked Russia's aggression against Ukraine, Turkey's role has not suffered, but rather has increased. As we can see, it is not only a negotiating role, but also a security role. And the Montreux Convention on the Admission of Military Personnel is just another confirmation of this. Therefore, it seems to me that Turkey's role has grown and will grow even more. Not only because it is in Erdogan's interest, but we see NATO's interest and even Russia's interest in it. I would like to talk to you about certain threats that are currently being broadcast in the information environment. Lukashenko says the Oreshnik missile system will be deployed in Belarus by the end of 2025. Putin has repeatedly stated that this complex is being or will be produced, that it will be mass-produced, and that it is a new and unique development that has never been done before. We see that a certain hype, both around nuclear weapons and around this Oreshnik, is being continued, brought about, and produced in the media. How do you feel about this news? I am absolutely calm. Why is this so? First, Oreshnik is a very expensive weapon. We are not talking about $1 million here, but several tens of millions of dollars for each launch. Even in Russia, which is pumped up with oil and gas money, there is not much money in this amount. They already have huge problems with their economy. Even Putin openly states on TV that Russia will reduce spending on the military-industrial complex because there are problems with the economy, because the economy is overheated by money from this military-industrial complex. Huge inflation. Just today, German Gref, the head of Sberbank, said that the Russian economy is going to have huge problems. So to listen to these statements that they will now make a huge number of these Oreshniks in order to throw them every day, one Oreshnik at a time, to shoot at Ukraine is just ridiculous. Because they cannot solve more trivial, let's say, problems. That is, to supply drones in large quantities, artillery shells in large quantities, tanks, and everything else. So a simpler and cheaper weapon, and in fact a weapon that is more effective on the battlefield than Oreshnik. I also need to mention what Oreshnik is. Oreshnik is an intercontinental missile that goes up into space, falls to its target from space, opens up, and drops cluster submunitions. It is designed to carry primarily nuclear weapons. There was a strike by this Oreshnik on Pivdenmash on the Dnipro. They were able to damage the production there, the workshops that had been empty for a long time. They smashed some windows, destroyed the building, but they could have done it much cheaper with other weapons, no matter how strange it sounds, no matter how cynical it is. That's why I'm very skeptical about all these threats about the placement, about Oreshnik, let's just say. Yes, by the way, a very serious and weighty argument, the one they made about the economy and mentioned German. And recently, Putin himself came out and said that they have to reduce defense spending because the economy is stalling. Again, this is in addition to what you said. I would also like to move on to other topics that relate directly to what is happening on the battlefield. Trump said he was closely watching the Russian army's next move in the Sumy region. We'll see. I am following the situation very closely, he said after visiting a migrant prison. A prison with alligators, as they say. At the same time, we are also closely monitoring what is happening. The General Staff writes that the Ukrainian military has begun to push the Russian occupiers out of the settlements of Sumy region, but the Wall Street Journal writes about 50,000 troops that the Russians are building up in this area. So let's try to balance the situation. In your opinion, what is going on? What is known? Firstly, we need to look at this situation in dynamics. What happened? Where we are now? The enemy's first activation, it started somewhere around the end of March, beginning of April. They were able to exert the greatest pressure and make their greatest territorial gains during May and perhaps the first half of June, even the first decade of June. Then they were able to go 5 to 7 kilometers from the border of Ukraine, deep into the territory of Ukraine, and were able to reach, at most, the outskirts of the village of Yunakovka. This was their first goal, which they wanted to reach. They captured villages along the border, but these villages are relatively small. They have always been small. Back in 2023, 2024, they were destroyed by artillery fire. Their main target, the first stage of their offensive, was the village of Yunikivka. Yunikivka is a large village with a border crossing point, and so on. The administrative center is quite large. Why was it important? Because in this village there are a large number of buildings in which the enemy could accumulate, could start some equipment, could store ammunition, food, and everything else. It could have become a stronghold for an offensive on Pizarivka, Khotin, and possibly on Sumy. But it didn't go as planned. They reached Yunikivka, and Ukrainian troops began to counterattack. Why did this happen? Because in May and June, when they were actively attacking and when we were in a stalemate, they wore down their most capable units, which they sent to this part of the front. These are the 155th Marine Brigade and the Parachute Regiment, which is considered to be their elite regiment, which they had to withdraw for rotation and recuperation. Because more than 50% of personnel losses and endless assaults on minefields under drone strikes and artillery attacks. Now the armed forces of Ukraine are counterattacking. If they are pushing the enemy back, they have already pushed them back about 1.5 kilometers. If you look at the dynamics in general, the enemy could hold out for about the entire month of May. If you look at the General Staff's reports, they kept up the pace of 170, 200, 225 assaults per day. Now they cannot keep up this pace. If we look at the General Staff's reports, it is usually 140 per day at most, sometimes 150. That is, they have significantly reduced the pressure. We are talking not only about Sumy region, but about the entire front line, including the hottest areas such as Pokrovsk and Toretsk. Therefore, at the current stage, we can cautiously say that the front line in Sumy region is stabilized and even we are repelling them and counterattacking. This doesn't rule out bringing in fresh units or transferring them from Pokrovsk, but for now, the situation seems stable. The deep state also writes the following statistics, not very pleasant, that in June the Russians seized 556 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. This is the worst figure for the year, they note. Last November was the most critical for Ukraine. Then the occupiers advanced by 730 square kilometers. What do these figures tell us? Because sometimes the interpretation is different. They say that these promotions, although they look the same on paper, do not change things in practice, but one way or another we see this dynamic, it is logical, because we are attacked, and we are defending ourselves and sitting on the defensive. But again, I think there are some logical considerations that can be made about this. Indeed it is. How do I see it? I mean, we lost the territory along the border in Sumy region. We can't say that we lost it forever, but the enemy managed to seize the territory there. We lost part of the territory in the Pokrovsk sector, near the town of Pokrovsk, because the enemy was preparing for the spring and summer campaign. They were accumulating forces, they were accumulating ammunition, they were preparing for this offensive. And since we are in a dead-end defense, I cannot recall any major counterattack actions. They only started at the end of June, when our command saw that the enemy was exhausted. That is, when it was possible to counterattack. That is why we were losing territory. When we are on the defensive, defense implies that we will retreat at some point, because holding some bush or some broken village with no houses left makes little sense to the last soldier. We retreated and lost some territory, but the situation remains under control. Most importantly, we are counterattacking and seeing Russian troops grow exhausted. In fact, this dynamic is continuing, and we see some successful operations being carried out. But you can't say that there is a stalemate. What can you say? In the sense of stopping the enemy, we do have such an opportunity. Given that the assistance from the United States, what is being said now, what is heard in the information environment, is drying up and becoming less and less. And Trump does not continue to be active, and they say that now there is a window of opportunity. If the United States does not extend this assistance again, the situation could worsen. Of course, we are critically dependent on the U.S. for some of our weapons. The most striking example is the Patriot and its missiles, and also artillery shells. This includes ammunition for HIMARS, which is the basis of our counter-battery warfare and strikes deep into enemy territory. These are 155 caliber shells, spare parts, and we have a huge number of American IFVs that we use, of various models from M113 to the most modern Striker, Bradley, and so on. That is, we depend on all this very much. But Trump is a businessman first and foremost. He thinks in terms of money. I am more than sure that he will not give help for nothing. He will give in exchange for something. Our allies absolutely have the opportunity to finance this assistance. Because all European countries, the European economy, it is comparable. It is comparable to the US economy. There are countries like Norway which has more than $1 trillion in reserves. Some countries, like Switzerland, hold over $1.5 trillion in reserves. And most importantly, Germany, for example, has lifted the restrictions on public debt. Not entirely, but they've raised the restriction bar, allowing them to issue bonds and use the funds to buy weapons. That is, it is absolutely possible to find a source of funding for the purchase of American weapons. I don't think we're in a stalemate or in a mood of defeat. It's too early to look for something we don't have. I am more than confident that we will find funding, and I am more than confident that we will get the weapons we need. I'll add some positive news, as the General Staff writes that on June 30th, Defense Forces successfully struck a command post of the 8th Combined Arms Army of the Russian Federation in the temporarily occupied territory of Donetsk region. Enemy losses are still being confirmed. This strike reportedly severely hinders their ability to plan and operate around Pokrovsk and Toretsk. Let's try to translate from military to non-military language, although everyone here has learned both languages by now, but let's comment. Maybe you know something about this situation. First, let's emphasize what the attack was about. It was inflicted by Storm Shadow missiles. These are precision air-launched missiles manufactured by our partners from the UK. French missiles Scalp are essentially the same thing. A missile with different warheads, so to speak. When they talk about destroying headquarters, a headquarters means several dozen very high-level officers in one room. And of course, these are not the last generals, not the last colonels in the Russian Federation. But when a new chief of staff, new deputies, new commanders of combat departments, and so on arrive at the army headquarters, it means that all these people will be getting up to speed for several months. Until they know the situation thoroughly. When they know the local geography, when they know how their enemy operates, when they know their allies, when they know their logistical strength, and so on. This is not to say that it means a complete cessation of hostilities in any part of the front, but it does mean that the effectiveness of the army's management will drop significantly in that area. By the way, let's talk about the military-industrial complex. Mr. Umarov said that we are launching a program of joint arms production with international partners in Ukraine and in the Ramstein countries. He referred to the legal aspects of this situation, and that the Ministry of Defense and the Committee on Finance and Tax Policy presented the key provisions of the 4 draft laws to the companies. In other words, we are talking about the bureaucratic component, which may be simplified in order to be more flexible. You may also know some details about this. Can we add this news to the summit where they said that the cost will also apply to Ukraine? And perhaps those security memorandums that our president signed. As we understand it, this is already being realized? I am more than sure that it is. First of all, we need our allies. Allies, Zelensky said very precisely that we can produce, say, 8 million drones a year, but unfortunately, we don't have the money to finance this. And we need to understand our allies. We come to them for money and say, give us funding for 8 million drones. But they want to lock up these cash flows, financial flows for themselves. A striking example is Renault, which will produce drones in Ukraine. And we are talking about more than 2,000 drones per day. And we are not talking about FPV drones, but about long-range drones with a jet engine, i.e., designed to penetrate enemy air defense and deliver significant strikes. First, Renault has vast experience in organizing mass production. Let's recall how many Renault cars we have seen even in Ukraine, let alone around the world. On the high-tech nature of Renault, which has been an F1 champion several times, so they know how to use high technology. And most importantly, they will then be confident that their investments, their funding, will be properly allocated and spent. I am more than confident that with the help of our allies, both financially and technologically, we will be able to obtain the necessary amount of weapons that our armed forces need to repel Russian aggression. Pavlo, thank you for your time, and thank you very much for joining us and answering our questions. Have a good evening. Thank you.